Ancient Terran legends speak of blood-drinking immortals possessed of great physical and mental strength, beings that must be destroyed utterly by fire and holy sacrament. I am of course speaking of the titular vampire, once largely assumed to be merely a forgotten myth. Recent review of the inquisitorial records of the Ordo Malleus have put forth an entirely different story altogether. A simple statement is all that is needed to summarize the review's findings. Vampires are real. The warp, a dimension that runs overtop our own existence. Not quite a parallel reality, more a sixth dimension in space that's generally difficult to access by normal means. Once a calm, tranquil sea where the psychic energy of sapient life would coalesce in beautiful displays of color and imagination, the warp has since become a dangerous maelstrom of violence, pain, and the worst avatars of human thought given almost corporeal form. Human space vessels have thus been forced to utilize Geller shields, ancient technology from the golden age of man, to protect themselves when they travel through the Imperium. To have one's Geller shielding malfunction or be sabotaged is to truly know the dangers of chaos-infested unreality. Once the thin, sparkling layer of protection is removed, the laws of three-dimensional space can quickly become mere suggestions. Time, the states of matter, and atomic principles can be bent or altogether thrown out the window. Still, if only this happens, you might be experiencing a rather decent day in the warp. What is just as likely to happen is that your suddenly unprotected ship will be quickly discovered by demons and monsters, shaped from legends in the collective unconsciousness. Carnage, disease, war. These beings might embody any of these distilled essences of the worst human experiences that have ever come to pass, and they will be very interested in you. Generally, such creatures have a hard time entering real space proper, having much more trouble doing so than mankind does when entering the warp. However, there do exist creatures that have somehow evolved in the Imperium, perhaps on stray planets once pulled out of real space, or aboard long-forgotten ships and structures. These beings, though little is known of how they survived the Imperium, are very much capable of existing in our own reality, and need only the slightest crack in space-time to slip back into it. The vampire, or at least one variation of it, is one such abomination. Vampires are large, human-sized, and bat-like creatures. They are bipedal and survive on the psychic energy of whatever race they choose to surround themselves with. If, say, they were confined to their natural and terrifyingly wrong-seeming true form, then it would likely only be a small matter of locating and eventually disposing of the average vampire. Unfortunately, this is far from the case. Vampires require no host body, having evolved their own naturally within the warp, making them one of the very few warp entities that can exist in almost all levels of reality. Terrifyingly, they also possess the ability to take on the shape of any sapient race. How difficult or draining this is for them is unknown, but one thing is certain: they need only be familiar with a species to effectively masquerade as one of them. There are no known physical tells that easily reveal a disguised vampire, making it quite difficult to pick one apart once they have begun their infestation of society. To further complicate things, while vampires are reliant on the consumption of psychic energy to survive, they only need the smallest amount of it daily, even going so far as to be able to survive mostly on regular food. A vampire feeds based on subtle touch and may draw their daily requirement from multiple sources. A victim may not even know they are indeed being drained, simply feeling more tired and anemic over stretches of time. They may never even realize the true source of their ailments at all. If a victim does eventually suffer the draining death of being a vampire's long meal, then they may be refused the embrace of their own demise. What the vampire has stolen from them can be replaced by foul warp energies, reanimating them into a slowly but surely rotting abomination enslaved to the creature that fed on them. Disturbingly, a vampire rarely drains anyone of all of their life force before their touch becomes fatal, meaning that there will be some small, broken, and confused part of a victim's consciousness still trapped in their own reanimated corpse. The revival of a victim is assumed to be up to the discretion of an individual vampire, and generally it might not choose to do so, as the creation of rotting thralls may quite easily draw the attention of unwanted investigators. Which brings us to another point altogether. The motivations of a vampire are a twisted form of the human drive for power. Vampires see anyone who threatens their parasitic quest for authority and pleasure as a rival, even going so far as to eliminate other vampires who come into their own established territory. Just why an alien race would evolve to only thrive among other sapient species is entirely unknown, though it is likely due to their own warp taint, which has left them unable to produce the psychic nourishment that they need to sustain themselves. Though hard to root out, to date there have been a number of instances where vampires have infiltrated human society. At an unknown time, the vampire Darren Marville took command over a small fortress on a small feudal world. He was presumably rooted out by local inquisitors, though records remain sparse on the exact nature of his disposal. More recently, one of these insidious creatures had risen to command an entire hive world on Cephan 5, one of the industrial centers of the Imperium. Vampires vary in power, but are largely as mentally powerful as the average human psyker. The vampire on Cephan 5, however, proved to be especially potent, requiring the intervention of the Black Templar Space Marine chapter to dethrone him. It was only through the direct aid of future High Marshal Helbrecht that the vampire was eventually disposed of. And though warp-spawn vampires do represent a clear threat to the Imperium of Man, there are other means by which creatures resembling the beast can be brought into real space, though that is an entry for another day. As is, vampire infestations occur only very rarely in Imperial records. Whether this is due to their species being low in numbers or having very few opportunities to escape the warp is unknown. Though there does exist the chilling possibility that the average vampire's abilities of disguise are simply so great that the Imperium merely finds themselves unable to root out the majority of these beings, with those vampires that have been discovered merely proving to be the foolish or exceptionally power-thirsty from among their number.